The humid summer of 1834 settled over South Carolina's low country like a suffocating blanket, the air so thick with moisture that breathing itself felt like labor, and the endless rice fields shimmered with heat that drove even the hardiest workers to the edge of collapse. In the slave quarters of Marshfield Plantation, sprawling across thousands of acres of reclaimed swampland 30 miles south of Charleston, field workers gathered in whatever shade the sparse live oaks provided and spoke in voices carefully modulated to avoid detection, discussing an extraordinary arrival that had disrupted routines unchanged for decades. According to local legend, this wasn't simply another enslaved person being absorbed into the brutal machinery of rice cultivation that made South Carolina's low country among the wealthiest and most deadly regions in American slavery. This was someone whose purchase had been demanded not by economic calculation, but by the explicit insistence of the plantation mistress, for reasons that had nothing to do with agricultural productivity and everything to do with the peculiar psychology of status, power, and the social competition that consumed the lives of white women isolated on vast estates surrounded by people they claimed to own. Fragmentary records suggest that what unfolded over the next 18 months would become a story whispered across the coastal South, a tale of how white women's desires and vanities could shape enslavement in ways as cruel and irrational as anything their husbands imposed. How visibility itself could become both curse and weapon when someone was purchased as a living symbol rather than a laborer. And how the particular brutality of rice cultivation would combine with domestic cruelty to create circumstances where extraordinary physical presence became a liability that no amount of strength or intelligence could overcome. South Carolina's low country in the mid-1830s represented perhaps the most extreme manifestation of American slavery's capacity for systematic brutality and extraction of wealth through human suffering. The region's economy depended almost entirely on rice cultivation, labor so demanding and dangerous that it killed workers at rates exceeding even the notorious sugar plantations of Louisiana and the Caribbean. The swampy terrain required constant maintenance of elaborate irrigation systems, work performed in standing water infested with malaria-carrying mosquitoes and venomous snakes, under a sun that could kill through heat exhaustion alone during summer months. Enslaved people in the low country died at such rates that the region's black population could only be sustained through constant importation, first from Africa until 1808, then increasingly through the domestic slave trade that brought people from the Upper South to replace those killed by disease, overwork, and the countless dangers inherent in rice production. Charleston had become the commercial and cultural capital of this wealth built on mass death, a glittering city where planters constructed mansions and lived in luxury, financed by profits extracted from operations they typically avoided visiting during the deadly summer months when malaria ravaged the rice fields. The city's slave market operated with a volume and brutality that shocked even visitors accustomed to slavery's operations in other regions, with thousands of people bought and sold annually in transactions that generated enormous revenues for merchants, auctioneers, and the city government through licensing fees and taxes. The society that maintained this system operated through mechanisms that distinguished low-country slavery from operations in other parts of the South. Enslaved people often worked under the task system rather than gang labor. Given specific daily assignments that could theoretically be completed in less than a full day, creating small spaces of autonomy that existed alongside brutal mortality rates and violence that made rice cultivation among the most feared destinations in the domestic slave trade. The legal structures governing South Carolina slavery reflected the state's history as the North American colony, with the earliest and most comprehensive slave codes, developed initially to control a black majority population and refined through generations of legislative adjustments responding to periodic uprisings and constant fears about resistance. The code was among the harshest in the United States, defining enslaved people as chattel property subject to their owners' absolute control, while also imposing collective punishments and restrictions designed to prevent any form of autonomous organization. Free black people existed in Charleston and occasionally in rural areas, but under crushing restrictions that made their status precarious and required constant documentation, registration, and demonstration of white patronage to avoid re-enslavement. Enslaved people in the Low Country were forbidden from learning to read, from gathering without white supervision, from traveling without written passes, from possessing drums or horns that might be used for communication, a comprehensive apparatus of control that attempted to eliminate every possible avenue for resistance or escape. Into this world of systematic brutality and codified oppression came someone who would demonstrate that rice plantation slavery's particular horrors could be compounded by domestic cruelty when white women channeled their own frustrations and social anxieties into treatment of people they controlled absolutely. The contradiction was inherent in low-country operations. Planters spent summer months in Charleston or traveling to northern resorts to escape malaria season, leaving their wives to manage both household operations and oversight of plantation management, creating situations where white women wielded enormous practical authority over enslaved populations, despite their legal subordination to husbands who were often absent for months at a time. Stories passed down through generations claim that Ecow arrived at Marshfield Plantation in June 1834, purchased at a Charleston slave market not because the plantation owner needed his labor, but because his wife had demanded his acquisition after seeing him displayed during what should have been a routine trip to purchase replacement field workers. The circumstances of this purchase revealed dynamics that shaped low-country slavery in distinctive ways, exposing the particular power white women wielded in a region where male planters' absences during deadly summer months meant wives effectively controlled plantation operations for significant portions of each year. According to oral histories, Arabella Thornton had accompanied her husband Marcus to Charleston that day on what was supposed to be straightforward business, purchasing 10 to 15 field workers to replace those who had died during the previous year's rice cultivation, a routine necessity in a region where annual mortality rates among enslaved workers sometimes exceeded 10%. But when the auctioneer brought Ecow to the block, standing 7 feet and 8 inches tall with a physique that suggested both tremendous strength and an almost sculptural physical beauty that made even hardened slave traders pause, Mrs. Thornton had insisted immediately that her husband purchase him regardless of price or practical utility. The bidding that followed became something of a spectacle in Charleston, with Marcus Thornton competing against several other buyers at his wife's relentless insistence, her voice carrying across the market as she directed him to continue bidding no matter what other planters offered. He finally secured Ecow for an astronomical sum, $2,600, more than quadruple what prime rice field hands typically cost, and a price that represented a significant portion of Marshfield's annual profits, even in good years. Oral histories preserved multiple explanations for Arabella Thornton's determination to acquire Ecow, despite the economically irrational price and his obvious unsuitability for rice field labor. Some accounts suggested pure vanity. She wanted to own the most extraordinary enslaved person available as proof of Marshfield's prosperity and her own status among low-country plantation mistresses. Others hinted at more complex motivations rooted in the intense social competition that characterized relationships among white women in the coastal elite, suggesting that a rival mistress at a neighboring plantation had recently acquired an unusually tall household servant, and that Arabella Thornton refused to be surpassed in the endless contest over domestic magnificence and visible wealth that these women waged through their possessions, including human property. A few whispered versions suggested even darker psychological dimensions, hinting that Mrs. Thornton's insistence reflected her own isolation during the months when her husband fled to Charleston or northern resorts to escape malaria season, leaving her alone on a vast plantation surrounded by hundreds of enslaved workers, and that owning someone as extraordinary as Ecow represented a kind of power and control she craved to compensate for abandonment and the terror of those lonely summer months. Whatever the true motivations, what seemed clear from all accounts was that Ecow was purchased not for any rational economic purpose related to Marshfield's rice production, but to satisfy the mistress's psychological needs in ways that had nothing to do with plantation productivity and everything to do with status, control, and the peculiar dynamics of power that isolated white women exercised over people they could dominate absolutely. Marcus Thornton completed the purchase with obvious reluctance and growing anger about being pressured into an acquisition that made no economic sense. But his wife's social standing among Charleston society and his own unwillingness to engage in public marital conflict meant he authorized the transaction despite recognizing it as financially foolish and practically problematic. What neither Arabella nor Marcus Thornton anticipated, what their different forms of arrogance prevented them from recognizing, was that they had purchased someone whose extraordinary physical presence would make traditional deployment impossible, whether in rice fields or household service. Someone whose size would create complications that no amount of violence or careful management could resolve. Ecow's height meant he was fundamentally unsuited for rice field labor. The work required moving through standing water and dense vegetation, where his size would be a liability rather than an asset. And the disease environment that killed normal-sized workers at horrific rates would be even more dangerous for someone whose larger body mass required more calories and whose extraordinary height would make him more visible to the mosquitoes that carried malaria and yellow fever. But he was equally unsuited for the household service roles Arabella Thornton had envisioned, his presence too dominating and unsettling to serve the decorative purposes she had imagined when demanding his purchase. The rhythm of life at Marshfield Plantation followed patterns established through generations of low-country rice cultivation. Brutal routines that distinguished between the field workers who labored in conditions that killed them at rates approaching those of Caribbean sugar plantations, and the household staff who served the Thornton family in the main house built on higher ground away from the swampy rice fields. Rice production required year-round intensive labor, maintaining the complex irrigation systems that controlled water flow through fields. Planting rice in spring, tending it through summer, harvesting in fall, and processing the crop through winter. The work was performed under a task system that gave enslaved workers specific daily assignments, clearing a certain area of land, hoeing a defined section of rice field, pounding a set amount of harvested rice, that could theoretically be completed in less than a full day if workers possessed sufficient strength and skill. But this apparent autonomy was illusory, a mask over brutality that made rice cultivation perhaps the most deadly form of agricultural labor in North America. The tasks were calibrated to push workers to their physical limits, and failure to complete assignments brought savage punishments administered by drivers and overseers, who understood that maintaining productivity required terrorizing people into working despite heat, disease, and exhaustion that would otherwise make the labor impossible to sustain. Marshfield's overseer, a man named Drayton, who had learned his craft on the most brutal low-country plantations, maintained discipline through systematic violence that included whipping, confinement in stocks, and more creative tortures designed to break spirits while preserving enough physical capacity that workers could still perform their assigned tasks. Echow worked in this environment from his first day at Marshfield, though exactly how to deploy someone of his extraordinary size presented immediate problems that neither the Thorntons nor Drayton knew how to resolve. He was too valuable and too extraordinary to simply assign to normal rice field labor, but his size made him unsuited for the work in ways that became apparent when initial attempts were made to incorporate him into field gangs. Moving through rice fields required navigating narrow paths between irrigation ditches and working in standing water, where his height became a liability, making him more visible to overseers but also more exposed to sun and insects, more likely to become trapped in mud that claimed boots and sometimes entire legs of workers who lost their footing. His strength was undeniable. He could move loads that would require multiple normal workers, but deploying that strength effectively in rice cultivation proved nearly impossible given the work's specific requirements. Arabella Thornton attempted to employ Echow in household service roles, reasoning that if he couldn't work effectively in the fields, he could at least serve the decorative purposes she had envisioned when demanding his purchase. But these assignments created immediate complications that exposed the fundamental miscalculation underlying his acquisition. When she positioned him at the main house entrance to greet visitors arriving for a social gathering, his presence didn't enhance the elegant atmosphere she had worked to create. It dominated and disturbed it in ways that defeated the entire purpose. Guests arriving at Marshfield found themselves confronted with someone whose head nearly reached the portico's ceiling, whose massive frame made the carefully proportioned classical architecture look almost toy-like by comparison. Rather than fading into elegant background as good household servants were supposed to do, Echow drew constant attention, making refined social interaction impossible as visitors found themselves unable to focus on anything except this extraordinary figure, whose very existence seemed to challenge every aesthetic principle the plantation house embodied. Local tradition holds that the first serious crisis occurred in July 1834, barely a month after Echow's arrival, during what should have been Arabella Thornton's triumphant display of her new acquisition at a formal dinner party hosting several neighboring planter families. She had planned the evening meticulously, intending Echo's presence to demonstrate Marshfield's continued prosperity and to establish her superiority in the endless social competition among low-country mistresses who measured each other's worth partly through the quality and extraordinariness of their household servants. She positioned Echow prominently in the dining room, calculated to create maximum visual impact when guests entered for dinner. But the evening proved catastrophic in ways that exposed how completely she had misunderstood what his purchase would actually mean for household operations and social standing. Guests found Ekau's presence so unsettling that the careful social choreography Arabella Thornton had orchestrated fell apart completely. His extraordinary height meant his head was well above the seated diners, creating a visual dynamic that felt threatening rather than elegant. His massive frame seeming to loom over the table in ways that made conversation difficult and comfort impossible. Some guests made pointed comments about the inappropriateness of employing someone so physically imposing in domestic service, suggesting that perhaps Arabella Thornton's judgment was questionable and that such an acquisition represented vulgar display rather than refined taste. Others seemed genuinely frightened by his presence, their discomfort palpable as they repeatedly glanced toward him, as if expecting some kind of violence or disruption that his size suggested he was capable of delivering. What happened after the guest departed, according to oral histories preserved across generations, revealed the particular cruelty that low-country slavery enabled, when white women channeled their social humiliation and rage into treatment of people they controlled absolutely. Arabella Thornton, enraged by the evening's disaster and the implicit criticism of her judgment from other plantation mistresses, whose approval she desperately craved, blamed Ekau entirely for the failure. She ordered him brought to the plantation's punishment area and had him whipped with a severity that shocked even Drayton, the overseer who had administered countless brutal beatings during his career. The punishment was savage enough to leave Ekau barely able to stand, brutal enough that scars would mark his back permanently. But the physical violence was perhaps less devastating than the psychological message it conveyed. He had been purchased not as a laborer whose productivity mattered, but as an ornament whose only value lay in enhancing his owner's status. And when he failed in that role through no fault of his own, simply by existing as he was punished with a cruelty that revealed how capricious and irrational power exercised by frustrated white women could be. The summer and fall of 1834 brought escalating tensions at Marshfield, as Arabella Thornton struggled to find any use for Ekau that would justify his enormous purchase price, while also satisfying her need to extract some return on an acquisition that had become a source of embarrassment rather than prestige. She attempted various roles, assigning him to tasks that ranged from heavy maintenance work to attempts at household service, but none proved workable within the constraints his extraordinary height imposed. When assigned to visible domestic service, he disrupted rather than enhanced household elegance through the attention his presence inevitably drew. When assigned to field labor, his size made him unsuited for rice cultivation's specific demands, and deploying him represented a tacit admission that $2,600 had been spent on someone who couldn't perform the work that Marshfield's economy depended upon. Whispered tales speak of Arabella Thornton's treatment of Ekau during this period, as exemplifying the worst aspects of the power white women wielded over enslaved people in their husbands' absence. The ways that isolation and social anxiety could manifest in systematic cruelty toward those who possessed no means of resistance or escape. She began finding fault with everything he did, inventing infractions that justified punishments administered to satisfy her psychological need to assert control over someone whose very existence reminded her of poor judgment that other plantation mistresses had recognized and judged. She would order him to perform impossible tasks, reaching heights that even his extraordinary stature couldn't access without equipment, moving objects whose weight exceeded any human capacity, and then have him punished when he failed to accomplish what she had demanded, using his inevitable failures as justification for violence that served no productive purpose but satisfied her need to exercise absolute power. Other household servants watched these interactions with growing horror, recognizing that Ekau was being systematically destroyed not for any actual inadequacy, but because his presence had become intolerable to a mistress who couldn't admit her mistake, and who possessed unchecked authority to make her frustrations his problem during the months when Marcus Thornton was absent from the plantation. The cruelty intensified during malaria season when the planter fled to Charleston, leaving his wife in practical control of Marshfield's operations and its hundreds of enslaved workers. Arabella Thornton's isolation and the terror she felt surrounded by people she claimed to own seemed to manifest in increasingly savage treatment of Ekau, as if destroying him could somehow alleviate her own anxieties and demonstrate power that her circumstances otherwise denied her. By late 1834, fragmentary records suggest that Marcus Thornton had begun to recognize that his wife's insisted purchase had created a crisis that threatened both Marshfield's finances and the family's social standing among Low Country's elite. The $2,600 spent on Echow represented capital that could have purchased multiple productive field workers or made improvements to irrigation systems that might have increased rice yields. Instead, the money had been spent on someone who served no useful purpose and whose presence had become a source of ongoing conflict and embarrassment. Other planters had begun making pointed comments about the Thorntons' judgment and household management, suggesting that perhaps they lacked the competence that distinguished superior families from lesser operations. Local tradition holds that matters came to a head in December 1834, during an incident that would become legendary among enslaved communities throughout the Low Country, and that would haunt the Thornton family for years afterward. According to these accounts, Arabella Thornton ordered Echo to stand motionless in the main house's entrance hall for an entire day as punishment for some trivial perceived inadequacy, intending his forced stillness to demonstrate her absolute power over even someone whose size might suggest capacity for resistance. Standing motionless for hours proved impossible, even for someone of Echow's extraordinary strength and endurance. Eventually, his legs buckled, and he collapsed to the floor, unable to maintain the position she had demanded. When Arabella Thornton discovered him collapsed, oral histories claim she flew into a rage that exceeded anything previous, demanding that he be punished immediately and with a severity that would ensure such disobedience never occurred again. What happened next exposed tensions that had been building in the Thornton household since Echo's purchase. Conflicts that went beyond a single enslaved person's situation to reveal broader dynamics of power, gender, and control within low-country slaveholding families. Marcus Thornton, present at the plantation during winter months when malaria risk was lower, reportedly intervened to prevent the punishment his wife demanded. According to multiple oral accounts, he told Arabella that her insistence on purchasing Echow had created an untenable situation from the beginning, that months of irrational cruelty had accomplished nothing except destroying valuable property, and that he would not authorize further violence that served no purpose except satisfying her need to assert dominance she had already demonstrated through systematic abuse. This refusal, delivered in the presence of household servants who would remember and repeat his words, represented an extraordinary breakdown in the united front that slaveholding couples were supposed to present before enslaved people. Arabella Thornton's response revealed just how invested she had become in exercising absolute power over Echow, how much his presence and her treatment of him had become central to her psychological equilibrium. She reportedly threatened to have Drayton administer the punishment regardless of her husband's objections, claimed that as the person who had insisted on Echo's purchase, she had primary authority over his management, and accused Marcus of undermining her standing among plantation mistresses by preventing her from maintaining proper discipline over her own household servants. The confrontation escalated in ways that made clear the Thornton marriage had been strained by Echo's presence, that his purchase had exposed conflicts between husband and wife that predated his arrival, but that his extraordinary nature had made impossible to continue ignoring. Marcus Thornton, facing both his wife's rage and the economic reality that Echow represented a massive investment that further violence might permanently damage or destroy, made a decision that resolved the immediate crisis while revealing the fundamental emptiness of slaveholding claims about paternalistic care or rational economic management. He announced that Echow would be sold immediately, that he would accept whatever price was available to eliminate the problem his wife's vanity had created, that the entire disastrous acquisition needed to end before it destroyed what remained of the family's finances and social standing among low-country planters who had begun questioning the Thorntons' competence. The consequences of this decision rippled through Marshfield and beyond in ways that illuminated the particular vulnerabilities enslaved people faced when their fates were determined not by their own actions or productive value, but by white women's psychological needs and social anxieties. For Echow, the announcement meant facing sale into unknown circumstances, almost certainly to brutal labor in the Deep South, where his size would make him valuable for the most punishing work in cotton or sugar production. The irony was devastating. He had been purchased to satisfy a white woman's vanity and social ambitions, had endured months of systematic cruelty because his very existence reminded her of poor judgment, and now would be sold away not because he had done anything wrong, but because his presence had become intolerable to those who claimed to own him. For other enslaved people at Marshfield, the incident confirmed what they had long understood about low-country slavery's particular cruelties, that their lives could be destroyed to satisfy white people's whims, that proximity to slaveholding families meant exposure to their psychological pathologies and marital conflicts. That being valued primarily as status symbols rather than productive laborers made people vulnerable to treatment that no economic logic could justify. The story spread through networks that connected enslaved communities across plantations, carried by workers who encountered each other at markets or on roads, creating narratives that emphasized both the dangers of being too extraordinary and the arbitrary cruelty that characterized white women's exercise of power over household servants. By January 1835, scattered documents hint that Marcus Thornton had sold a cow to a slave trader for less than half the original purchase price, taking a catastrophic financial loss but eliminating the immediate source of household conflict and social embarrassment. What happened to Eco after this sale remains largely unknown, swallowed by the systematic gaps in historical records that characterize the domestic slave trade's operations. Some oral histories claim he was sold to a cotton plantation in Mississippi, where his extraordinary strength would be exploited until his body broke under labor designed to extract maximum short-term productivity, regardless of long-term consequences. Others suggest he was purchased by a New Orleans merchant, who employed him in commercial operations where his size remained valuable, but where the dynamics differed from the psychologically destructive household service he had endured at Marshfield. A few accounts even claim that Ecow died during transport to his new owner, his body finally succumbing to the months of systematic abuse and inadequate nutrition that Arabella Thornton's cruelty had imposed, becoming just another casualty of the domestic slave trade that killed thousands through disease, violence, and the trauma of forced separation from everything familiar. The truth, whatever it was, disappeared into the deliberate erasure that characterized enslaved people's experiences in historical records controlled by those who benefited from slavery's continuation, and who had no interest in documenting the arbitrary cruelty and economic irrationality that often characterize the institution's actual operations. What seems certain is that Ecow's time at Marshfield left permanent marks. Physical scars from months of punishments administered to satisfy Arabella Thornton's psychological needs, but also deeper wounds from experiencing the particular cruelty of being purchased as an ornament and then systematically destroyed when he failed to satisfy purposes he had never been consulted about and could never control. His story became part of the oral traditions that enslaved communities throughout the Low Country preserved across generations, a tale that captured essential truths about how white women's power over household servants could manifest in ways as brutal as anything male slaveholders imposed, about how social competition and psychological frustration could determine fates with consequences as deadly as the rice field labor that killed thousands. The impact of Eco's story persisted long after his departure from Marshfield, creating conversations that revealed anxieties about the particular dynamics of Low Country slavery and the power white women wielded during the months when their husbands fled malaria season and left them in practical control of vast plantations. For enslaved communities, the tale became evidence of how vulnerable people were to white women's whims and social anxieties, how vanity and status competition among plantation mistresses could destroy lives as surely as any overseer's whip. Workers on other plantations whispered about the giant who had been purchased at a wife's insistence and then destroyed when he couldn't satisfy expectations he had no role in creating. Using his story as a warning about the dangers of being too extraordinary or too visible, about how sometimes survival required being unremarkable enough to avoid becoming a symbol in white people's psychological dramas. For white society in the Low Country, particularly among plantation mistresses who heard the story, reactions varied based on their own relationships to household slavery and their psychological investments in the status competitions that consumed their lives. Some expressed criticism of Arabella Thornton's judgment and treatment of Eco, using the incident to establish their own superior household management skills and more refined approaches to domestic service. Others defended her implicitly, recognizing that admitting the cruelty of her actions would require acknowledging uncomfortable truths about the power all plantation mistresses wielded and the arbitrary ways that power could be exercised during the long months when husbands were absent and women controlled household operations without direct male supervision. The deeper truth that Ecow's story illuminates extends far beyond the specific circumstances of one extraordinary individual purchased to satisfy a white woman's vanity and then destroyed when reality failed to match her expectations. His experience reveals the particular cruelties that Low Country slavery enabled when white women's isolation, social anxieties, and frustrated agency manifested in treatment of people they controlled absolutely during the months when male planters fled disease season. The combination of rice cultivation's brutal mortality rates and domestic cruelty, driven by psychological pathology, created circumstances where being extraordinary became a death sentence. where someone purchased for decorative purposes could be systematically destroyed through violence that served no economic function but satisfied white women's need for control and status validation. Ekau's extraordinary height made these dynamics visible in ways that normal-sized household servants' experiences might not have. His very extraordinariness making him impossible to ignore or render invisible in the background as domestic service normally required. He was purchased not for productive labor, but to satisfy complex psychological needs that Arabella Thornton probably couldn't have fully articulated, needs for visible proof of wealth, for superiority in social competition, for power during months of isolation and terror surrounded by hundreds of enslaved workers. When he inevitably failed to satisfy these inchoate desires, when his presence created embarrassment rather than admiration, the violence turned against him reflected not just one woman's cruelty, but the broader pathology of a system that gave frustrated, isolated white women absolute power over people whose only crime was existing in ways that didn't serve their owners' psychological needs. Stories passed down through generations preserve knowledge about these particular dynamics of low-country slavery that official documents systematically excluded. Knowledge about how white women's exercise of power during their husbands' absences could be as destructive as anything male slaveholders imposed. About how isolation and social competition shaped enslaved people's fates in ways having nothing to do with their own actions or capabilities. The truth of these stories lies not in their precise factual accuracy, but in the experiences they represent and the knowledge they preserve. Knowledge about how slavery destroyed lives to satisfy white people's psychological needs. About how being valued as a status symbol made people vulnerable to treatment that rational economic calculation would never justify. About how the Low Country's particular brutality combined household cruelty with rice cultivation's deadly labor to create some of the worst conditions enslaved people anywhere endured. And sometimes, according to the legends that communities kept alive when official history tried to erase them, that arbitrary cruelty and irrational destruction stood 7 feet 8 inches tall, purchased at a white woman's insistence to satisfy vanity and social ambition. Destroyed through months of systematic abuse when reality failed to match expectations, sold away at catastrophic financial loss, when continued presence became intolerable reminder of poor judgment and the emptiness of claims about paternalistic care or civilized household management. Ekau's time at Marshfield lasted barely more than 6 months, but his story rippled through enslaved communities across generations, creating narratives that preserved knowledge about domestic slavery's particular cruelties, about how white women's power could be as deadly as rice field labor, about how being extraordinary made someone vulnerable to treatment having nothing to do with their worth, but everything to do with their owner's psychological pathologies and the toxic dynamics of isolation, fear and frustrated agency that characterized white women's lives in the brutal world of low-country slavery.